Hello everybody, and welcome back for another video. Today we are going to be talking about parasitic mind control and looking at the chemical imbalance myth and how that ties into schizophrenia as well as some other things. But before we do, I'd like to talk about a movie real quickly that actually focuses on parasitic mind control.
You know, what better way to ease us into this topic than talking about the movie called They Live, which is one of these cult classic movies, and I'm guessing most of you have seen it, but it kind of sums up pretty well the way that things seem to be going with our current society. But They Live, I believe, was a 1988 science fiction movie directed by John Carpenter, and it follows this unnamed drifter who is played by Roddy Piper, and he discovers that the ruling class are aliens, concealing their appearance and manipulating people to spend money, breed, and accept the status quo with subliminal messages in the mass media. And it's not until in the movie, it's not until he finds these sunglasses and he puts them on, and those glasses allow him to see the form of these entities, these parasites, and they're very hideous. But they've conscripted all members of the police and the government officials and agencies, and all these people are working with these parasites. So it's this one massive conspiracy basically, and he tries to figure out how to, there's a signal that's being sent out and it's allowing these entities to be cloaked, but he tries to figure out where the signal is coming from and destroy it. So great movie. I'm guessing most of you have seen it, but what I kind of wanted to bring up before we get into our discussion today is how these parasites communicate with each other using these watches during the movie. And there are several scenes where they're all talking into their watches, and it's kind of creepy because you can see their true form. But and even the police, some of them are policemen, and they're talking into their watches. And there's even a scene where this gentleman, this is in a bank, and he not only does he communicate with the watch, but he uses the watch to open up a portal or a gateway that he goes through, and it takes him, I believe their lair is underground. And why I wanted to mention that is just because John Carpenter, he seems like he's one of these directors that they're tapped into what's really going on behind the scenes, just like Stanley Kubrick with films like 2001 Space Odyssey and Eyes Wide Shut. John Carpenter almost appears to be the same way. So, you just always wonder, are they trying to tell us something? But the thing with the watches, what caught my attention with that is when you start looking at these Sumerian depictions of the gods, they're wearing these, what appear to be these, something similar to a wristwatch, even though it probably has some other function. But you've got these deities wearing these watches, and here's an up close shot of one of these watches, and they do seem to like holding that pine cone for some reason, but I think that's supposed to be like the pineal gland. But these it's always the same pattern on the watches too. But this gentleman here, he's got two of these watches, one on each wrist, and here's just one more. But again, these ruling elite with these watches, and it just makes me wonder how there's this similarity and to the movie where these elite, these alien parasitic elite that are talking into, communicating with their watches, opening up portals to their lair underground. And I just thought I'd mention that. I mean, just for interest's sake. But that's enough of that for now. So let's actually start looking into some of the things I want to talk about today. And we'll start it off by talking about chemical imbalance. So let's get started.
Now I'd like to get into this subject of chemical imbalance myth with regards to schizophrenia, because I came across this interview on a channel called Night Flight. And she interviewed this person by the name of Jerry Marzinsky, and he is a mental healthcare practitioner and counselor with 35 years of experience, both in the state hospital and both in a state hospital and in a prison system. And what really what resonated with me is he talks about chemical imbalances and how people who are hearing voices or schizophrenic were told that they have a chemical imbalance. And as you're going to find out when you listen to the interview, the science behind that statement is not there. We don't really know what the cause of these voices is. And again, this resonated with me because growing up, there was another family that was friends with my family growing up, and they had a son who was about 5 years older than me. And he ended up developing schizophrenia in his early 20s. Now, he tragically ended up losing his battle with schizophrenia and the voices, and he took his own life. And I just remember thinking, what sort of mental disease manifests as voices which are always negative? And I just never really sat well with me. But it was a long time ago, and I just hadn't really thought about it until I saw this interview. And Jerry Marzinsky, he interviews a lot of these patients who are hearing these voices, which is something that is typically not done. And he actually asks patients about the voices, and because there's a lot of unsettling patterns to these voices, as opposed to just random delusions. There's a consistency to a lot of these voices. So I'm just going to present to you about 25 minutes of this interview, and there's just so many mind-blowing things that were brought up, and I couldn't capture them all in the video just for time constraints, but I'll leave a link to this video. And I want to thank this channel, Night Flight, for allowing me to share some of it with you guys. And of course I will leave some links. And so I'll play about 25 minutes, and I'll come back after and we'll finish up.
Good evening, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Judith Krober, and tonight I have Jerry Marzinsky with me. He has been working as a mental health practitioner and a counselor for 35 years, and I'm very happy to have him here and his insights. So, Jerry Marzinsky, welcome to Night Flight.
Okay, thank you for having me. Basically, I've been at this for 35 years. I worked for 7 years in the biggest state mental hospital in the United States. From there, about 18 years working in the psychology department of a state prison. And that's where I learned a lot.
So what sparked your suspicion that there might be something else going on than what the official...
Oh, I can tell you that. The first suspicion I had, and when I first started work at the state hospital, I believed like everybody else. I was taught, and everybody else believed, that this was a chemical imbalance of the patient's brain, and that these medications, and what they were major tranquilizers, somehow temporarily straightened out whatever that imbalance was. But as I watched a number of different psychiatrists, they never gave even one course of lab work to try to check and see what that chemical imbalance in the brain was and how far off it was. Regular doctors, they'll give you blood work and you have all these scales and they say, oh, well, it falls in between this scale, and so it's high, it's low, it's in between, we need to do this to bring it up. No, it wasn't that. All they would say is, oh yeah, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's exactly what the drug representatives were telling them. So the first thing I noticed is, here they are saying there's a chemical imbalance, but they don't know what it is. They have no way to measure it. They have no lab tests for it. They have no EKGs or EEGs or anything else that will definitively show that there's a chemical imbalance. And if there is a chemical imbalance, which of the 32 or so neurotransmitters in the brain are imbalanced? They have no way to measure it, but yet they're going out there and they're going, it's a chemical imbalance, and these drugs will set it right. So that was my first clue that something was off. Here they kept pushing this chemical imbalance, which they had no proof for, they had no measurement for, and they had no lab work. So, what's going on here? Why are they doing this when they have no proof?
So, and at what point did you decide to encourage the patients to talk about their voices and what they are hearing?
I think that was after one of the common things that I saw in working with these schizophrenic patients was that their voices would often tell them to kill themselves. They were no good, and they didn't talk much about that, but and they were very hesitant to talk about their voices, because every time they did, the psychiatrists would jack up their medicines. So here were the voices, in several cases telling them to kill themselves, and matter of fact, a lot of them did. So you kind of go, well, what is this thing telling them to kill themselves? And if the psychiatrists heard that, somebody reported to them that the voices are telling this patient to kill themselves, right away they're put on suicide watch. It's treated as a serious threat. They're locked up. They're drugged up. They're filled with antidepressants and antipsychotics, and they're put in a room where they can't hurt themselves until they're no longer suicidal. So the psychiatrists would act as if the voices were real and there was something substantial to them when they heard that the voices were telling these patients to kill themselves. They would react like, somebody stuck them with a hot poker, and they, okay, lock him up, and order these medications and don't let him out until he's not suicidal anymore. But anything else the patient tried to tell them about what the voices were saying were completely blown off as hallucinations. Why are they treating the voices in that case, where they're telling the patient to kill themselves, as real and reacting to them as real, but anything else the patient tells them that these voices are saying is considered to be a stupid, crazy hallucination due to a chemical imbalance that they've never been able to prove? I'm like, well, ain't that a little bit odd? What is it that was holding these voices on a consistent negative pattern? What confined them to negative, upsetting verbiage? Why weren't they just all over the place? What held them on to just abusing and mocking the patient and telling them all kinds of bad things and telling them to kill themselves? What was doing that? The pattern was that these voices were consistently negative. Consistently. They never told the patient anything good unless it was to get them in trouble later on. So I'm like, well, that's odd. What kind of hallucination would tell a patient to kill himself? And then the other strange things I was seeing was, doing my rounds in the psychiatric rehab center, and every time the chaplain had a ice cream social down in the main meeting area, all my schizophrenics were on the ward. So here they are sitting on this dingy ward instead of going down there and eating ice cream and cake, which were hard to get hold of there. And I'm like, well, that's odd. And I saw that time after time. And then I started asking them, well, why are you staying up here? Why aren't you down there with the other guys getting ice cream and cake? Well, I don't like church, and I don't like preachers, and that's a bunch of crap. And it was consistent. It was like, so I started asking them some questions about, well, why is this? And periodically I'd hit the voices get louder when I go into those places, when I go into the churches. So I started wondering, well, I never took the word of just one patient. I would take the question I asked and then start asking. I had an unlimited supply of schizophrenics there. So I'd start asking these others, and time after time they'd say, well, yeah, the voices don't like the Bible. They hate the 23rd Psalm. When I read the 23rd Psalm, they act like worms thrown onto a hot frying pan. And I'm like, whoa. So I started handing out the 23rd Psalm, and I got the same response. All these patients said the voices hate it. They hate when I read the Bible. I said, well, what did they tell you? And they said, well, Jesus couldn't even protect himself. What makes you think he's going to protect you? And this is the voices telling them this thing. And I'm like, this is a hallucination. Hallucinations are supposed to be random. I mean, they're supposed to be all over the place. They're, the second thing I noticed later was amphetamine kind of like opened the door to these things. More prisoners were sent to prison for committing crimes while they were psychotic on amphetamine than any other drug that I ever saw. So it's like it opened the door to psychosis. It triggered psychosis, and it was like they were going psychotic, and it was like once they became psychotic, they stayed psychotic. It didn't go away. But what was tricky about it is when they first started, they'd start hearing these voices. They'd go, oh, well, I'm just hallucinating because of the drug. And they're thinking, well, okay, it'll go away. And they stop using the drug, and it does go away. And that happens for many times. And then one day they use it, and it doesn't go away. They're there, and they can't get rid of them, and they're there forever, and they're now psychotic. Whatever these things were, they invaded. So I started asking questions about amphetamine, and these people would see something called the shadow people consistently. They were three-dimensional shadows that would enter their rooms at night, follow them around, and usually show up at the foot of their bed and be staring down at them. They never spoke. And I noticed, and I actually used this clinically, if they saw their eyes, they were in much worse shape than if they didn't. The majority of them never saw the eyes. If they did see eyes on these shadow people, they were either lime green or they were red. Neither color is not something I'd want to meet somebody with eyes of that color. I mean, right away, it just kind of sends chills up your back. Then I noticed that virtually every schizophrenic who was put on these medications would eventually go off and go psychotic again. And I'm like, well, why is that happening? But, and I'd ask them, and they'd all say, well, it's the side effects. The side effects are awful. And they were. But what didn't make sense is when you compare the side effects, which were bad, to going insane and becoming floridly psychotic. It was like, okay, which do you want? You want the flu, or you want the bubonic plague? And they were all choosing the bubonic plague. And I'm like, well, why are you choosing the plague? And I'd ask them, well, why? I mean, which is worst? And they'd say, well, the plague's worst. And I'm like, well, what am I missing here? What is it they don't understand? Why are they consistently, and almost all, this happened with almost all of them, at one time or another, they'd stop taking their meds. And yeah, that was true that and I'd ask the staff, I said, well, why do you think they stopped taking their meds? And it's like they want to go psychotic, and that's much worse than the side effects. And, oh, well, that's just a symptom of schizophrenia. I'm like, a symptom of schizophrenia. And they didn't even want to know why. They weren't even curious. 3 years, 3 or more years, I kept asking the same question over and over again. And I started feeling crazy because you ask the same question over and over again, and you get the same answer, that doesn't make sense over and over again. It's like expecting a different result, and it's not coming. So it was my last year at the state hospital, and one little gal got into trouble. She went off her meds. She was doing good in classes. She was going to cosmetology class, and she was doing good while she was on her meds. She went off her meds for the third time, and they were about to discharge her from the program because if they won't stay on their meds, they're not going to be able to function. They're not going to be able to work. And her mother and I are asking her, why? This is the third time you went off your meds, and every time you did that, you went insane. Why do you keep doing it? And she goes, I'm not sure I want to tell you, and I'm like, well, we got to know something, otherwise we can't keep you in the program. Are you going to keep doing this? And I said, why after 3 times, each time you having to be rehospitalized because you went psychotic, why do you keep doing this? And she said, because the voices told me that those medicines were poison. And I don't know how many times I've heard that from psychotic patients. A psychiatrist is poisoning me. They're trying to kill me. They're poisoning me. That was a common excuse. And psychiatrists indeed were attacked at many times the rate of any other doctor or any other staff at the hospital. And so that clicked. Okay, these patients are assaulting psychiatrists because they believe these medications are poison. And here's the voices telling them that they're being poisoned and the psychiatrists are being attacked. But what really broke me was the stories that a lot of these prisoners were telling. The first one that we worked on, the first breakthrough I got where we actually got rid of the voices, was this guy who used to work on Wall Street. And he had making tons of money. And he started using a lot of meth and amphetamine. And then he started hearing voices. And he was married for years, and he was hearing voices for years, and his wife never noticed. And I said, how did that happen? How could she not tell? He goes, well, I'd go out into the garage and I'd just talk to him myself, and she'd catch me and I'd just tell her I was just talking to myself. So the voices didn't like his wife. They don't like wives. They hate little kids. They hate the person being in any relationship. What they want to do is poison any relationship so they have the victim all by themselves where they can't get any help. And he came to group one day, and I started working with him. He was one of the chosen guys. And finally, when I learned enough about how to get rid of these things, his voices one day in the office, when we tried this last thing, they disappeared, and they screamed as they left. They screamed, and he sat there stunned, and he almost fell out of his chair. And I'll never forget his words. He turned at me and he looked and he said, the silence is deafening. Because it was the first time in decades he had not heard the voices. They weren't talking, they were gone. And he was in shock. He couldn't move, he couldn't stand up, he couldn't get out of the chair. He just sat there like, So at that point I learned enough to be able to help the patient, teach the patient how to get rid of these things. And there was another one of the guys I was working with intensely, who would, and one of the requirements I had for them was, listen, I'll go out of my way to help you. I'll bail you out of whatever trouble you get into, but I want you to tell me in live time as we sit here what those voices are telling you as we're speaking and their reaction to what I'm saying. And the ones I always had a group of them, maybe, 10 or 17 that I was working with, and there were tons of them that didn't want to do that. They wouldn't agree to do anything like that. But I always had a group the whole time I was at the prison where they were different ones, but they always agreed to do that. So here's this one guy, he's getting better and better and better. The voices are getting less and less and less. So he comes in one day and he said, the voices are really getting pissed at you. They're really angry with you. And I'm like, you got a hallucination who's getting angry with me? He goes, yeah, they're really upset with you. They don't want me coming here. They're saying you're crazy, you're stupid, don't listen to anything you say. They're really getting angry. They don't want me coming here. And I said, wow, that's weird. And so he kept coming because he was getting better. And we kept working. He comes in one day without an appointment. So I figured he's in trouble. And he knocks on my door and he goes, he comes in the office and he says, the voices want to talk to you. And I'm like, they want to talk to me personally? And this has never happened before. All the other interactions, I said, what are the voices saying? Well, they're telling me this. So it always went through the patient. They were always telling me what the voices were telling them. And the voices never came out and talked to me personally. But here he is telling me the voices want to talk to you personally. And I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, they want to speak to you. And I'm like taken aback. So here's more evidence that these things are not, some figment of the unconscious. So he comes in, he sits down, and I said, well, what is it they have to say? And I'll never forget this. His voice tone changes just a little bit lower. And these words come out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. And I'm like, bam. And he said, that wasn't me. That wasn't me saying that. And I'm like, what the blazes is going on here? It was at that point, after getting all this other information for years, that my denial system, it was just hanging by tatters, completely collapsed. About that time, I was reading a book written by the shaman Miguel Ruiz, who was talking about these entities that enter people's minds and tell them bad things, and that they were energy parasites. Now, one thing I'd noticed was that every time these voices attacked a patient, their energy level would drop down to almost nothing. And here they are laying in bed all night. They're not exerting themselves physically at all, but in the morning after being attacked by these things, they were so weak, a lot of them couldn't even get up to go eat breakfast. So here I bring this in, he comes in, he sits down, and I said, tell me what you think about what this guy's a shaman, tell me what you think about what he's saying. And I start reading it to him. And every once in a while I glance up, and as I'm reading it, he's kind of staring at me like with this strange look on his face. And then I hear this electrical crackle just explode from behind my head like an arc welder. And it's like it just sounds just like an arc welder. I know that crackling sound. And I'm like, what the devil is that? And I turn around and I don't see anything there. And it starts moving up the wall at a 45-degree angle toward the ceiling at the back of the room. And this, I look at this guy and he's just staring at me with these blank eyes, just like a zombie. He's just staring at me. And I'm like, what is going on here? And it's like crack, 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 all the way up the wall. And I'm trying to see what that is, but I don't want to take my eyes off of him either, because I'm suspecting he's going to attack. He's looking really strange and he's just staring at me in this odd way. So I push my chair back against the wall, kind of halfway expecting him to attack from the strange look he had on his face. And I'm trying to see whatever's making this noise, and I couldn't see anything. And I didn't want to take my eyes off him for too long, so I'm going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then it goes across the ceiling over his head, so I can keep an eye on him and also search the ceiling. And it's, I see nothing, I smell nothing. I just hear this crack, 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 crack. And then it starts coming down at a 45-degree angle toward me. And I'm like, what is going on? And it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can near my left leg, and it's crackling in there. And I turn and I look down there briefly, and I still don't want to take my eyes off him, and there's nothing in there. You know, the inmate porter had cleaned it last night, and there was nothing there except this crackling sound coming from this thing. And I asked the guy, the prisoner, I said, do you hear that? And he didn't respond. He's just staring at me with these zombie-like eyes. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? And then the sound stops, and he slowly gets up, and he goes, I gotta leave. And I'm thinking, like, yeah, get the hell out of here, man. Go. Yeah. So he goes down the hall, and I'm sitting there stunned. And I walk up, and I search. I look closely at the walls, and there's no burns. There's no sign that anything ever happened. I can't account for what happened. I go out into the hall, and I check all the other doors, and none of the other medical staff are in yet. You know, the doctor's office is locked, the nurse's office is locked. Everything's locked. There was nothing that I could see that could account for that sound. And I was shocked. I was stunned. I just sat there like stunned. You know, it's like I'd been hit by a taser or something. I couldn't think straight. It was like my mind fogged out. And I'm thinking, if they can do that, if they can make the walls crackle, what else can they do? And what am I getting myself into here? The voices that these people hear are thoughts being put into their minds. They're being injected into their minds. And not only that, these things have access to their entire memory. So they can go in there and they can pull up every rotten thing these people ever did and bring it up, dredge it up, and rub it in their faces until their emotional state turns negative. And then they drain that energy. So what they are is emotional parasites. And it doesn't just happen with schizophrenics. Remember, the schizophrenics are the 5% of the normal curve. These things are hitting us all to different degrees. And it's most obvious where you're kind of cruising along the street, and all of a sudden, minding your own business, kind of you have your same old thought stream running there, thinking about this and that. And then a thought comes in that's just horrifying. It's like something you would never think, something you would never do, something you would never consider. And you kind of go, whoa, where did that come from? And from what I've seen is that every negative thought that flows into your head about yourself or somebody else is put there by these entities, and they want you to react to it. And that will generate the negative emotional energy that they feed off of.
Looshing.
You got it right on. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's what it is. They want that loosh, and that's how they generate it.
Well, I thought that was quite a powerful interview. And again, that was just 25 minutes of an approximately 2-hour video. So if you thought that was interesting, there's just many, many more details that I couldn't get to. So I'll leave a link to the full video. But what I did want to stress here is that I know that this is a very sensitive subject, and I mean no disrespect. I'm just asking questions. I've had this affect me indirectly as well, so I just really want to know, and that's where I'm coming from. But the implications are pretty vast, and what I did want to touch on real quick is near the beginning of the interview, the voices, they didn't like, what was it, Psalm 23. Now, I don't know if it was mentioned in the interview, in the longer version of the interview, or if it was from another interview I heard with Jerry Marzinsky, but he mentioned that the voices also didn't like when the song Amazing Grace was being played. For some reason, the voices they tend to not like inspirational music, and he mentioned either in this interview or another one that they don't like the song Amazing Grace. And what caught my attention about that is there's this Japanese scientist and researcher by the name of Dr. Emoto Masuru, and he's developed this technique to examine under a microscope and photograph the crystals that are formed during the freezing of different types of water. And then he then photographs the water that's been exposed to prayers or music or words after it's been frozen. So this water, the water that is subjected to vibrations or words and positive thoughts, they form these beautiful crystals similar to those of the snow. And the water that's subjected to the vibrations of words and negative thoughts reacts, creating very amorphous structures and a lack of harmony. Now, the process, I believe, distilled water is used, and I think it's one vial full of this water is placed between two speakers, and subsequently the water is exposed to various musical tracks from beginning to end, and then the water is frozen and photographed. Now, what I want to mention that is because they played, this researcher and doctor, he did an experiment where he played the song, he went through this process, played the song Amazing Grace, and froze the water and photographed it, and it, as you can see here, you have this very regular pattern. So it's interesting to me that these parasites, demons, whatever you want to call them, they don't like this song, and it matches this very regular pattern, which is associated with positivity. And as you look at some of the patterns that are formed when they expose the water to these different songs. Now, when you look at the song, a heavy metal song, it's very amorphous, disjointed, and of course you have heavy metal music is typically associated with darkness, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the parasites probably don't mind heavy metal at all, but they don't like worshipful music or songs like The Amazing Grace. There's Imagine by John Lennon and a Beethoven song. So I think I just found this very interesting because the parasites don't like these very uplifting, positive songs, and those songs, they have this effect on water, and the water forms this very geometric structured shapes. And when you take a look, speaking of very geometric structured shapes, when you look at all of the star forts, very, very geometric and very structured, right? And I can't just help thinking that there's a connection here, because a lot of these star forts, they've probably been decommissioned from whatever their true purpose is or was. And the fact that the parasites don't like that song, Amazing Grace, and it forms this beautiful geometric pattern. And here you have all these decommissioned star forts which have these beautiful geometric patterns. But yeah, so a lot of takeaways from this video, and one of them is not every thought you have is your own, especially the ones that are negative, either very negative reaffirming type of thoughts like you're not good enough, no one likes you, that type of thought, or some thought that is tempting, it leads you to a sin. Those two types of thoughts, potentially, they're being generated from outside of yourself, And these parasites have the ability to interject thoughts into your stream of conscience. And I've experienced this personally, and I'm going to talk about it in my next video. I have gone through, I went through about a year and a half of, I guess what you would call demonic oppression, where I was being physically attacked by things I couldn't see. And I was having thoughts that were very much out of character, and I'll go into it, and I'll put all my cards on the table in my next video, but there's just a lot more to this, and it's just all kind of starting to come out now, but I think it all ties together. So I guess I'll leave it here for now. Thanks for hanging with me, and until next time, take care. Bye.